Good evening. I'm Mehdi Hassan. Russia's military must be held accountable for its war crimes. That was the message from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today at the UN Security Council. His remarks came as evidence of more Russian atrocities against Ukrainian civilians are being exposed. Zelensky urged the Security Council to take action, saying that at least 300 people were killed and tortured in Bucha, a suburb of Kyiv with more apparent war crimes yet to be uncovered. What we've seen so far has been horrifying. A warning that the images are disturbing, some of the worst ever to emerge out of a war zone. These are really horrific pictures, pictures of bodies littering the street in Bucha, young men with their hands bound behind their backs, shot and then left to rot in the roadside. Human Rights Watch on the ground in Bucha urging the survivors of Russia's months-long occupation to protect the evidence for any future trials. Those haunting images and allegations of war crimes prompted a fifth round of sanctions from the European Union, and NBC News was first to learn that the White House will be following suit with more sanctions of its own. Question: how can the Russian people be okay with what their government, their military is doing to their cousins in Ukraine? Surely at this point, with these pictures, the Russian people must be up in arms. But no. According to an independent Moscow pollster, 83% of Russians surveyed say they approve of Putin's actions. That's up from 69% in January, before the war, and Putin's highest job performance rating for 5 years. Even with all the caveats about polling in Putin's authoritarian Russia, you have to ask how so many Russians could support their country carrying out alleged war crimes, even genocide, according to President Zelensky, against the people of Ukraine. The explanation, to put it plainly, is that the Russian propaganda machine is powerful. Independent journalism in Russia is limited, if near non-existent now, with most major news outlets either owned outright by the state or by companies with close ties to the Kremlin. And the vast majority of Russians get their news from those state-run outlets, especially television, where they're told Ukrainians are bombing themselves, bombing their own cities. It's definitely not the Russians. No, no, no. They're told all those bodies seen strewn about the streets of Bucha were staged there by the Ukrainian military. And they also hear from anchors like this guy. Have a listen.
Наши подлодки способны выпустить более 500 ядерных боеголовок, что гарантированно уничтожают США и все страны НАТО в придачу. Это по принципу «зачем нам мир, если в нем не будет России?». О РВСН даже не будем и говорить. Суммарно российский ядерный потенциал самый мощный в мире. Сейчас вся российская триада переведена в особый режим боевого дежурства. Путин предупреждал: пугать Россию не надо.
That news anchor you just heard is Dmitry Kiselov, also known as Russia's Prince of Propaganda, according to the LA Times, who uses his highly rated Sunday night news show to push whatever it is the Kremlin is selling. On that particular Sunday, at the war's outset, he was in lockstep with Putin when the Russian leader threatened the prospect of nuclear war with the West. He also pushes Kremlin talking points to his millions of viewers on the conflict in Ukraine itself, like Ukraine is ruled by fascists, Russia is clearing Ukraine of Nazis, and the Russian military strategy is methodical, not indiscriminate. All lies. And oh yeah, Putin appointed him to head a powerful pro-Kremlin media group in 2013. But it's not just Kiselov. In a chilling op-ed published by a state-run news agency, a Russian pundit argues that the majority of Ukrainians are Nazis, and he says that Nazis should be, quote, liquidated. He advocates for the, quote, de-Ukrainianization of Ukraine, calling it an artificial anti-Russian construct. This week, I'm running out of ways to say horrific. But that's the language, the propaganda of genocide. And that propaganda seems to be working. One New York-based filmmaker shared recent conversations she'd had with her mother about Ukraine. Her mother is an ethnic Russian in Belarus. Quote, use your brain. Russians don't kill civilians, her mother told her. Who did it then? The Ukrainian fascists. Nazis, her mother replied. This is how you get a population behind your war. You dehumanize your enemy. You tell your people you're trying to root out the enemy, and you crack down on any domestic dissent. At the beginning of Russia's invasion, we saw protests across many Russian cities, with police soon detaining people on the street. Russia even passed a law that literally makes it illegal for journalists to refer to Russia's actions as an invasion or a war. Here's what just a few people in Moscow told NBC's Keir Simmons only 2 weeks ago.
Describe President Putin.
It's very good.
Very good.
Хороший. Good.
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 You think he's good? You think he's excellent?
Yes.
I fully agree with Putin. Any action, any decision.
For others, simply answering is too difficult, perhaps even dangerous.
What do you think of President Putin?
No.
What do you think of President Putin?
Oh, no comments.
So no, to be fair, not every Russian is willing to express support for Putin or this war. And it's easy to feel sadness, pity, or even anger about the disinformation being fed to Russians and how they're reacting. But ask yourself this: is it really all that different than what's happening here in parts of the US too? Just look at the most watched news network in the country.
Has Putin ever called me a racist? Has he threatened to get me fired for disagreeing with him? Has he shipped every middle-class job in my town to Russia? Did he manufacture a worldwide pandemic that wrecked my business and kept me indoors for 2 years?
Joe Biden telling us get out of Ukraine immediately. Was this a ruse? Was this whole thing an effort to take everybody's attention away from what Hillary Clinton did?
This is a lot like other stories that we've gone through in the digital age, in which an image is taken and then played over and over and over again to create some kind of emotional response out of you, because that makes a profit.
Russia may have their prince of propaganda. We have those guys who not only echo some pro-Russia talking points on air, but also push domestically our own big lie that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. He didn't. And after 6 years of Trumpian misinformation pushed by a pro-Trump media, the effects on parts of the American public is evident.
Who would you rather have president, Joe Biden or Vladimir Putin?
Oh, Putin. Definitely.
And why is that?
I believe he's been given a tough... Since World War II, Russia's been the bad guy, when in actuality the Nazis left Germany and they ended up going to the Ukraine, coming in here. George Bush was actually... Thank you. George Bush was actually a Nazi.
Why do you love President Trump?
Well, he's honest. He's a Christian. He's anti-abortion. And he calls it like it is. He says what all of us are thinking. And not too many people can do that.
Honest is the absolute last word any sane person would use to describe Donald J. Trump. And to prefer a foreign autocrat over your own democratically elected leader, even if he's one you didn't vote for, is bonkers. But again, the propaganda machine works. A UMass Amherst poll from this past January found that an astonishing 71% of Republicans believe that Biden probably or definitely did not legitimately win the 2020 election. Later in the show tonight, we'll talk about the rise and rise of QAnon, too, on the right. But let me say this, don't discount either the way war can rally a people around their government, not just in Russia, but here in the US, too. As recently as 2015, a majority of both Republicans and Fox viewers still said they believed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, even though it didn't, and that particular George Bush lie has long been debunked. So we can look at what's happening in Russia right now and think to ourselves, those poor, brainwashed, lied-to Russians. But we also need to recognize what's happening here at home, too, with our own brainwashed and lied-to Americans in some parts of the country. And recognize how our own democracy is being undermined and threatened by shameless media propagandists on the right, feeding them those lies. My guest tonight is Russian-American journalist Alona Minkovsky, formerly of HuffPost and also the Russian state-owned English-language broadcaster RT America, which ceased all operations in the US last month, shortly after the invasion. In a recent Twitter thread, Alona said, Russians are being fed a polar opposite narrative about this war than what the rest of the world is seeing. I urge people not to underestimate the power of both propaganda and fear. Alona joins me now. Thank you so much for coming on the show this evening. You were born in Moscow. You have family in Russia. Your mother is a member of the Russian parliament, the Duma. You've worked for Russian state media. For people in Russia, is there any breaking through the propaganda coming from state-run media right now?
Thanks for having me, Mehdi. Well, as you have laid out, the options have continuously narrowed there because all independent media has been pushed out. Almost all Western journalists have left for fear of their own safety because of the law that has been, pushed that punishes with up to 15 years in prison, going against the official government line. So a lot of Russians, there are not a lot of options for Russians. Of course, there are ways to get around, even the blocking, which I didn't mention yet, of things like Twitter, or at least the slowing of Twitter, the blocking of Instagram, the blocking of Facebook. For those Russians who really want to seek out other information, they can get VPNs. I know people who are doing that, but that requires action. That requires actively seeking it out. And Russia, like the United States, is a country where there are a lot of demographic differences too. Older people tend to watch more TV. They tend to listen to radio. And so that is where the majority of people are getting their information, are just these state-controlled outlets.
Alona, what do you hear from your friends, family members, former colleagues about this war, those especially who aren't buying the state-sponsored narrative? Do they just have to keep quiet? I mean, the anti-war protests we were covering at the start of the war, they seem to have been crushed or dissipated.
It's very different, the conversations that I have between the people who are still in Russia and those who have left, because those who have left, fled, right, picked up and dropped everything, their entire lives, to maybe just hop over to another country where they didn't need a visa, like Turkey or Georgia or Armenia, and try to sit it out, maybe rent an apartment on Airbnb, right? They aren't in a place where they can be punished right now for their language and the words that they use. So we have very honest conversations about what's happening. For those that are within Russia, including my own family members, including friends and other people that I know there, of course, there is a lot of fear. And I feel like the conversations we have are very cryptic. There's always this concern that maybe somebody is listening in. And, you have to think about the way that this plays out for just Russians in their daily lives too, right? This type of the lack of trust that exists, that someone might rat on you. I'm not sure if you saw the story today, that there was a teacher who said that the invasion of Ukraine was a mistake, and a student ratted her out to her, or told the parents, and the parents ratted her out. And so now she's being fined. Wow. It's this environment that is just full of fear, of distrust, where you can't utter a word of truth. And I think that, that's not to say, obviously, again, that even all people who are in Russia right now buy into this propaganda and this narrative, but they're too scared to go against it. And maybe some people are in denial and trying to convince themselves that this is right.
So you mentioned family members. Can I ask, what is your relationship like with your mother right now? She's a member of the Duma, I believe a supporter of Vladimir Putin and a supporter of this war. Is this something you're able to discuss with her? How hard is that for you to engage with her when all these atrocities are happening in Ukraine? And I assume she's okay with it.
I speak with my mother as often as I can. And I think, in many ways, it's the kind of relationship that maybe some people here who have political views that differ from their family members have, right? Where you try to argue with them, you try to speak some sense to them, and sometimes you have to just let it go and you have to move on because it doesn't get anywhere in that immediate conversation. But as I mentioned before, I would not underestimate the level of fear. The reason that we don't see people protesting in the tens of thousands in the streets anymore, the way that we did in the beginning of the war, the reason that we don't see Russian officials and the government resigning en masse is because there is no option for them to do that. There is no option for any dissent that will not be punished, or, in the case of public officials, publicly punished, right, and scrutinized too.
So, Alona, you've recently made something of a return to Twitter to denounce Russia's war in Ukraine. You've condemned it, but you've faced some criticism that your own condemnation of Russia is late in the game. You had a little bit of a back and forth online with Liz Wall, who, like you, once worked at Russia Today. What do you say to the critics who suggest this might be some kind of PR stunt, or who try and pull your family into their argument and say, look, you're just trying to cover for yourself because of your links to your mother?
I don't know what it means to cover for myself with my links to my mother. She's my mother, right? It's very open. It's very public. And I have very often spoken publicly at the fact about the fact
just to be clear, I guess the argument is, let me just jump in. I guess the argument is they would say, your critics would say, you worked for Russia today. You didn't condemn Putin until now. Now you're doing it. It's because everyone's under pressure post the Ukraine invasion. So that's what I wanted you to be able to respond to.
Yes, of course. I think, listen, yes, I worked at RT, and criticism of that is absolutely fair and it's absolutely warranted. And I like to say two things about that, which is that it's something I've been trying to deal with and, reconcile with for the last 10 years because I quit working at the channel in 2012, but I still have to reconcile with choices that I made early on in my career. So for those who don't know me, for context, I was 22. It was my first job out of college. And it was a time when there seemed to be an opening of relations, a reset between the US and Russia. And, and there was a time when RT wasn't looked at with such skepticism. I had lots of journalists from establishment, news organizations, hosts from MSNBC on my program. So times have clearly changed. But all of that is also not an excuse, right? Ultimately, that job that I had, it questioned and, opened up for criticism my integrity as a journalist. It forced me to compromise my own values, and it's something that I regret participating in. But another thing I would say, too, is that to those that claim that I have never spoken out about Putin before or that I'm doing this now, that also isn't true. And I don't expect someone to follow my every single career move, but there are people out there who are lobbing attacks against me that are also misinformation and based in mistruth. So one thing that I'll say, about RT, about this entire conversation that you and I have been having is that propaganda isn't always about just bold-faced lies, right? It also is in omission. It also is very insidious in the way that it just slowly drips. So what we're seeing in Russia today, these things about dehumanizing Ukraine, that is horrible. But also that is following years and years of this slow effort within Russia to feed people propaganda that tells them to be anti-Western, that tells them that they have been pacifying, the separatist republics within Ukraine to all build up support for that.
And I guess as the Ukraine invasion carries on, we'll have more and more conversations about is there ever going to be a turning point when it comes to Russian propaganda and the citizenry? You mentioned the teacher today, a fascinating example. Alona Minkowski, appreciate you coming on and taking my questions. Thank you so much. Still ahead. How did a QAnon talking point make its way into Republican questions during a Supreme Court confirmation hearing? And where does this propaganda on the right end? We're back in 60 seconds. In December 2016, a North Carolina man armed with an AR-15 walked into a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor, fired 3 shots and demanded access to a basement dungeon there that did not exist. He believed the restaurant was part of a child sex ring run by and for powerful Democratic politicians. It was the conspiracy known as Pizzagate. And that was the bizarre culmination of an online movement that had gained steam throughout the presidential campaign that year on websites like Reddit and 4chan. Users riffed off each other, posting that Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and George Soros were all in a cabal of pedophiles. One user posted that Hillary Clinton was running because she knew she'd go to jail if Donald Trump was elected. You might expect that Trump winning the election would have caused this movement to fade. But QAnon, a grand theory of the universe for far-right conspiracists, was there to pick up where Pizzagate left off. It began with a single internet post in late 2017 from someone claiming to have top-secret security clearance, saying that Hillary Clinton was about to be arrested. She wasn't, shock horror, but the cryptic and unhinged postings of Q gained a following on multiple social media sites. And the conspiracy theory ballooned like crazy. At different points, Q claimed that the CIA installed Kim Jong-un in North Korea, that former DNC chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz used the MS-13 gang to kill a low-level staffer, that German Chancellor Angela Merkel was really Adolf Hitler's granddaughter, and that the Rothschild family ran a satanic cult. That last one is an ages-old anti-Semitic trope that could have come from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Child-eating pedophiles were everywhere, from liberal Hollywood to the boardrooms of multinational corporations. And according to Q, they would all be snapped up by Trump and the real patriots in the storm, delivered for summary execution or military trial at Guantanamo Bay. None of that, of course, came true, but the facts didn't get in the way of the messianic movement, whose faithful followers could be seen at every Donald Trump rally. In fact, when Vice President Mike Pence took a trip to Florida in 2018, one of the local SWAT team members on his security detail wore a Q patch front and center on his uniform. He was later disciplined and demoted. By 2020, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert had been elected to Congress, two Republicans who had openly encouraged QAnon conspiracy theories. I wonder why they felt so emboldened.
I don't know much about the movement other than I understand they like me very much.
Let me ask you about QAnon. It is this theory that Democrats are a satanic pedophile ring and that you are the savior of that. Now, can you just once and for all state that that is completely not true and that disavow QAnon in its entirety?
I know nothing about QAnon.
I just told you.
I know very little. You told me, but what you tell me doesn't necessarily make it fact. I hate to say that. I know nothing about it. I do know they are very much against pedophilia. They fight it very hard.
Right. And in addition to Trump winking at his conspiratorial supporters, QAnon propaganda got an online boost from foreign countries like Russia and China. I mentioned earlier in the show how effective Russian propaganda is at brainwashing ordinary Russians. But look at QAnon here at home, an example of American right-wing propaganda at its best and worst. How else to explain that a poll taken last year by the Public Religion Research Institute found that 15% of Americans, 15% agreed with the core QAnon tenet that the levers of power are controlled by a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles. That number rises to 23% of Republicans, almost 1 in 4. Even worse, only 1 in 5 Republicans outright reject QAnon. As one pollster put it, if QAnon were a religion, it would be as big as all white evangelical Protestants. Maybe that's why so many mainstream Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee commandeered the confirmation hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson with baseless accusations that she was soft on child sexual abusers.
Every judge who does what you're doing is making it easier for the children to be exploited. I also see a record of activism and advocacy as it concerns sexual predators.
So I can only wonder, what's your hidden agenda? Is it to let violent criminals, cop killers, and child predators back to the streets?
But all of that, as offensive and nuts as it was, all of that was a nudge and a wink compared with the conservative backlash yesterday to 3 GOP senators who said they would vote to confirm Judge Jackson to the Supreme Court. That backlash led, of course, by who else? Marjorie Taylor Greene, who said, quote, any senator voting to confirm KJB is pro-pedophile just like she is. She was joined by supposedly serious conservative Sean Davis, co-founder of the right-wing Federalist website, who went after his party's former presidential nominee. Quote, Mitt Romney opposed KBJ being on the courts until he learned she had a soft spot for child rapists. Davis was joined by his site's editor-in-chief, Molly Hemingway. Quote, the only new info since Romney voted against her a few months ago was increased awareness of her soft-on-pedos approach. I can't tell you for certain if all that was a coordinated smear effort, but Republicans don't seem to care about kids nearly as much as they appear to care about getting you to believe that Democrats and liberals drink the blood of children and sell kids through coded pages on the Wayfair Furniture website. The upshot of these efforts is one that depicts their political enemies as subhuman monsters who don't deserve to walk free, let alone get a seat on the Supreme Court. Although they might have another reason for opposing this particular Supreme Court nominee. Remember the Pizzagate shooter I told you about a moment ago? He was sentenced to 4 years in prison by a federal judge who told him he had left literal psychological wreckage in the wake of his attack. That judge was Ketanji Brown Jackson. Let's bring in Susan Del Percio, Republican strategist and MSNBC political analyst. Also here with us, NBC News senior reporter Ben Collins, who covers the dystopia and disinformation beat and has reported extensively on QAnon. Thank you both for joining me. Ben, let me start with you. You've been following this for years now. How surprised are you that something that began as online randos posting fantasies about their political opponents being strung up for paedophilia is now an ever-present force in a major political party that could take back Congress this year.
I'm not surprised at all. This is a big part of the Republican base now. It's a large part of their talking points, and they cannot avoid them. They sort of have to thread the needle here. I guess the surprising part is how quickly the evolution went into pretty blatant, open homophobia in these places. Really, the genesis of this stuff in the mainstream part of the right isn't necessarily QAnon. QAnon is what they're winking at. It's why they know they have a base there. But the thing that they're winking at is this idea that basically any homosexual is a groomer of children. That's what you see in this Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. The idea that people who talk about sexuality to anyone under the age of 18 or something, people who talk about the idea they might have a husband if they're a man or a wife if they're a woman, they are implicitly trying to convince children to also be gay. It's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. But it's the big thing that's taken off on the far right recently. It's pretty much the only thing that these far right places talk about. They talk about Ukrainian biolabs, which is the Russian right-wing conspiracy theory that is trying to justify the Ukrainian invasion. And they talk about what they believe to be groomers. Basically, they share TikTok videos of teachers who are, gay, and they tell their kids that they're gay if they're asked. And they say they're grooming kids, that they're trying to get kids on it. And it's very dark stuff, but it happened in about a month, and it's very, very grim.
Yes, the speed is astonishing at the way that suddenly Disney is now on Fox and every right-wing news outlet nonstop, where Disney's being accused of being pro-pedophile and pro-groomer. You have to always, in a very dark way, you do have to admire the message discipline on the right, the way they can make these bonkers conspiracies mainstream so quickly. Susan, I have to ask you, Marjorie Taylor Greene is very concerned about sex trafficking of minors, she says. And yet here's some footage from the cross-country America First fundraising tour that she went on last year with Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz, who's under federal investigation for sex trafficking. Investigators are looking into whether Gaetz slept with a 17-year-old female for money. He's not been charged with a crime. He denies all the accusations. But the irony here that a party that has people like Matt Gaetz in its ranks, that had people like Roy Moore run for the Senate in Alabama accused of child molestation, this is the party that wants to make pedophilia into a party political wedge issue?
Well, first, I'd just like to say Ben's reporting on this issue is so important, and everyone should read it because it is a great thread into understanding how this has all evolved over time. And a lot of times, I've often said this, I think that Donald Trump needs these folks more than these folks need Donald Trump. And while Marjorie Taylor Greene is, beyond an extremist, I'd like to say she's just, we have to write her off, but she is a large voice in the party right now, simply because Republicans do not have the courage or the backbone to stand up and say what she is saying, to call her out on what she's saying. The Republicans in the Senate hearing, specifically Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and Josh Hawley, they are cowards, they are despicable, and they are anti-democratic, hating this country people for spewing those words. This justice stood there and judge took this line of questioning, which was deplorable. And I dare any of those men to be able to stand there for 1 second and keep their composure with such vile hatred spewed at them. There should be no room for this in the Republican Party.
But Susan, isn't that the problem, though? That it's one thing for Marjorie Taylor Greene and Donald Trump to spout this nonsense. But Ted Cruz, whatever you think about him, he's not dumb. Like, when he goes all in on child sex abuse at a Senate confirmation hearing, he knows exactly what he's doing. And as you say, it's cowardice against the base. He wants to be president, and he's willing to take a QAnon base with him in his attempt to win the White House, right?
And anyone who does that, like Ted Cruz, hates this country and do not believe a word he says. Anyone who loves this country would never, ever get up and use that kind of conspiracy theory, especially someone who knows better. And let's be clear, this group is this is a group that, again, will always be happy finding a new leader. It's not just about Donald Trump, which Ben will tell you about. You now see the likes of Ted Cruz auditioning for the QAnon vote.
Yes.
That.
Ben, let me ask you this. You've followed this for a long time. Where does it go next? Because you've got, as you said, the timing is crazy here, because we just played a clip of Trump in 2020 defensively dealing with a question from Savannah Guthrie from White House Press Corps. It was controversial then. Now it's so open. 2 years later, you've got these members of Congress, Boebert, Green, people who had disowned QAnon, now basically running QAnon talking points. 15% of the American public believing this stuff. Where does it go from here?
Well, the thing with QAnon is to always push the line. They're habitual line steppers. That's the words I would say for what QAnon is. It's to always push the line of the Overton window further to the right, back to where it was in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. Just keep pushing it back. And they will latch on to social movements that are big at the time. They'll latch on to the CRT moral panic. They'll latch on to this same moral panic, this now anti-gay, this groomer moral panic that is being pushed by the very same people. That's what you're going to see in the future here. You're going to see constant dehumanization, the ability for people to make liberals or make people on the left appear as an other that can eventually be, used as, it's basically a way to set up, in their eyes, maybe potentially sectarian violence. That's how you get to these points. That's how you got to the Pizzagate shooter. That's how you get to all this QAnon violence. That's the point of this, is to otherize and dehumanize the other side.
We should remind our viewers that the FBI has referred in the past to QAnon as a domestic terror threat, and that is the reason why, because of what you're laying out there. Susan, last quick question to you. Ben mentioned at the start and just a moment ago about how this has become about anti-gay propaganda as well. This is about groomers. This is about age-old tropes about gay teachers preying on children. The Republican Party at one time seemed to have made its peace with gay rights, or at least gay marriage. The last president, even his vice president, Mike Pence, shut up about it while he was vice president. Now, the trans stuff, the pedophile stuff, it's all leading back in one direction, which is to roll back. We heard a Republican senator say, gay marriage, should that be on the table in the hearings? John Cornyn said, is that where the party's going now?
I think, unfortunately, temporarily, yes. We see state legislatures in red states around the nation looking to duplicate the bill in Florida. I do think that, unfortunately, this is where Republicans will go because they think that will help them win. It will eventually tear them down. I believe that in my heart of hearts. And they will have to basically weed out all of these people to create a decent party again.
Yeah, let's see if that happens. Certainly not anytime soon. Susan Del Percio, Ben Collins, thank you both for your analysis. Appreciate it. Still ahead, the new tactics dictators are using to consolidate power. We talked to the author of Spin Dictators after the break. It's a conversation you won't want to miss. Next month, Vladimir Putin will mark a decade as president of Russia, having served 8 years as president as well between 2000 and 2008. He's been in power so long that it's easy to forget just how quick his ascent was in the late 1990s, or how he helped create a new model for what authoritarian leaders would look like. Dictators like Mao and Stalin wore military uniforms and kept their populations in check through overt fear and repression. But in the late 20th century, something changed. Strongmen around the world started turning up to meetings in conservative suits instead of military uniforms. Many flew to the annual business conferences in places like Davos to schmooze with the global elite. They did not loosen their grip over the population. Far from it. They worked to design more effective instruments of control. But they did so while acting and looking the part of democrats. A new book, Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century, sheds some light on how Putin and other authoritarian leaders have been able to consolidate power in a more PR-friendly way. For example, Putin happily used the language of democratic elections in 2011 prior to his own presidential win. Until recently, he hobnobbed with the global elites while wearing his designer suit. And when he invaded Ukraine earlier this year, he tried to couch it as a heroic special military operation to stomp out Nazism. But as the Spin Dictator authors remind us, this flashy image doesn't make Putin any less authoritarian or brutal. After he was inaugurated to his third presidential term in 2012, Putin used his popularity and celebrity to consolidate power, cracking down on election protests and pushing out opposition politicians. But with pictures coming every day of Russian atrocities in Ukraine, surely that softer, more moderate image that Putin tried to manufacture for himself is over. Or does the Spin Dictator have a way out? With me now to help answer some of these questions is Daniel Treisman, one of the co-authors of Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. He's a professor of political science at UCLA. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the show. You write that spin dictators don't openly censor their media and that visible violence against the public is a mark of failure. It undercuts the desired image of enlightened, responsive leadership. Given the fact that Putin has shut down the last independent television stations in Russia, is now perpetrating horrific visible violence, does he still qualify as a spin dictator in your view?
No, he doesn't. And in fact, he's a great example of somebody who started out really as a pioneer of this new model of dictatorship, which is just much more subtle, less overtly violent, and relying much more on manipulating information. But in the end, reverted back to what we call fear dictatorship, which is the model of the classic dictators of the 20th century. Very violent, openly repressive, and based on terrorizing society rather than fooling it into genuine support.
You write in the book that understanding the hallmarks of this new kind of dictator, quote, manipulating the media, engineering popularity, faking democracy, limiting public violence, and opening up to the world is crucial for the West to craft effective responses. What do you think is an effective response from the West?
Well, at this point, Putin is clearly a fear dictator. He's engaged in a level of aggression that nobody expected until very recently. And the only response is sanctions, beefing up the defenses of NATO, containment, and all the things that, unfortunately, we had to worry about during the Cold War. But for other spin dictators, people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, leaders of Singapore, then the best strategy is, first of all, to be much more aware of what they're doing, to monitor more carefully the trade and international financial links with these countries and the various ways in which they try to seek influence and pursue non-democratic goals through international institutions and through international relationships. So we've got to monitor that. We've also got to build up our defenses against things like money laundering, influence peddling in the West, using of corruption to pursue goals which have a lot to do with undermining Western institutions and so on. The big problem is, in the past, we've sort of thought about dictatorship as being identified with this very brutal, obvious model. Yeah. And we haven't known what to call people like the early Putin or the early Erdogan or Hugo Chavez. And so they've often been...
On that note, you know, as you say, we can distinguish between the fear and the spin now. Leaders like Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, they were generally seen in the West as dangerous autocrats, no matter how much they try to spin their images. But what about leaders, what about allies, leaders of allied countries like Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's been able to spin to some American audience, especially elite audience, spin them into believing he's a reformer, that he's leading Saudi Arabia to democracy?
Well, I think that reflects on the listeners rather than the Saudi regime. People hear what they want to hear, but it's pretty clear that Saudi Arabia uses a high level of violent repression. And although they do try to conceal that in international relations, it's pretty clear within the country what the limits of permissible political behavior are. But there are people, obviously, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has really exploited the difficulties we have in identifying what type of regime he leads. He's benefited from massive transfers of EU funds, and he's used them to consolidate a regime which is less and less even pretending to be fully democratic.
Yeah, very good point. And Orban, of course, re-elected this week. You say that it's important in the book, you say it's important to have a robust resistance of informed citizens to secure the institutions of free government and make them work. Considering that 40% of Americans do not believe that Joe Biden was legitimately elected, and a vast majority of Republicans do not believe he's legitimately elected. Do you think it's possible to have a robust resistance of informed citizens in America today? What is the state of American democracy in the context of spin authoritarian rule?
Well, we have to be concerned. Obviously, we've seen many things happen in the last few years that nobody anticipated. And in some ways, Donald Trump is very much trying to do what spin dictators have done in less developed democracies and less consolidated democracies, trying to appeal through Twitter with sophisticated propaganda to his base, calling the media fake news, the independent media, and so on. And clearly he wanted to eliminate checks and balances, eliminate controls on his power, but he failed. And I think that shows that the U.S. does have this resilience. It may have been a close call at times, but
it was a close call, and I guess some of us are still worried about 2024. Daniel Treisman, thank you so much for your time tonight. He is co-author of Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. When we come back, a letter in 2014 outlined the plot of a Muslim takeover of British schools. The plot was fake, but it fueled a wave of Islamophobia in the UK. Earlier this year, I spoke to the host of the New York Times podcast that investigates that entire story. You can hear that conversation on the other side of this break. Don't go away. So, a pretty shocking and mysterious letter appears at a local city official's office. It outlines a detailed, step-by-step plot by hardline Muslims to take over public schools. The plot even has a code name, Operation Trojan Horse, and the letter is said to be from one of the plotters. This actually happened. So you can imagine that when the letter was revealed in 2014, it shook Britain and became perhaps one of the biggest school scandals in that nation's history.
State schools have been targeted by groups wanting to promote a hardline Muslim ethos.
MPs have been told how a violent extremist film promoting jihad was shown to pupils at a Birmingham school.
Birmingham City Council failed to act on suspicions about a hardline Muslim takeover in some schools.
This kind of stuff shouldn't be happening in our schools, should it?
But what if all the news that followed, all the people who were investigated, the teachers who were banned from teaching, and all the counter-terrorism policies the government implemented afterwards was all based on a plot that was fake? And what if everyone kind of suspected, maybe even knew it was all a hoax? It didn't matter. I lived in the UK at the time and covered this story closely back then. And the reality was, and in many ways still is, that any suggestion, no matter how uncorroborated and unlikely, that Muslims were involved in extremism was enough to turn a local administrative issue into one about national security and creeping Sharia. A counter-terrorism expert was appointed to investigate the schools, a choice criticised by one of Britain's most senior police chiefs at the time. Also by members of parliament and local officials who said it would needlessly instill fear and hysteria and tear apart communities. A new podcast by Serial and the New York Times, The Trojan Horse Affair, revisits this story to pick up where investigations stopped. Who wrote this mysterious letter that upended Muslim communities and shook an entire nation? What have officials been hiding all these years? And why does it matter today?
Hamza and I spent years running this down.
I'll give you a clue. Who is the letter defending? Is the question you have to answer.
But figuring out who wrote the Trojan Horse letter.
I didn't write it. I don't know who wrote it. Well, my job to find out who wrote it.
I'm not the author of the Trojan Horse letter.
That was only the first mystery we were up against. It started to seem like officials knew more than what they were letting on, all the way from a local primary school to the highest levels of British government, and that Hamza and I were poking at something that people did not want to talk about.
Can you give us a bit of details about that situation?
No. It is particularly important that I don't.
The two co-hosts and executive producers of the Trojan Horse Affair, Hamza Sayed and Brian Reed, join me now. Thank you both for coming on the show this evening. Hamza, let me start with you. You're a doctor, but you decided to change careers specifically for this story, and you reached out to Brian with the idea. Why was it so important for you to pursue this?
I mean, it wasn't specifically for this story. I left medicine long before I started journalism experience. But this story specifically, I mean, just regardless of the convenience of the fact that it's down the road from me, like I'm from Birmingham, I just saw it as like a tipping point, and maybe this naive. I saw it as a tipping point where up to this point, I had imagined that in order to be a target of something by the authorities, there's a genuine suspicion involved in that process. When the Trojan horse that turned up, I didn't understand what was going on. There was no evidence. I didn't understand why the whole country was suddenly focused on these schools. And it kind of, for me, just like settled in that I think we're all suspect in some sense. All of us Muslims living in the West are suspect in some sense. And I think that's what it was about this story that just stuck with me from the time it happened up to the point when I went to journalism school.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. And Brian, one of the things that's been fascinating about the whole series that you guys have made is that there are many people directly linked to the story who refused to speak to you. But that didn't stop you guys. In fact, it became part of the story. I want to play a clip of a moment where you're questioning a man who did agree to speak with you, Peter Hay, a top council officer. And you can tell how uncomfortable he is. Have a listen.
Well, what's the evidence? That's what we want to know.
It's set out in here.
Is it, though?
So... you've got that well, I've sent out over two sides. The failure to take into consideration things.
Brian, were you surprised at the way some of these people acted after you chased them down all these years later?
Yes, I was very surprised. It was hard to tell sometimes. Are people hiding something? Is there something they don't want to talk about? Or this narrative was so powerful that there was something bad happening in the schools, that Muslims were plotting to take over schools. It was such a powerful narrative that has become what one person in the story refers to as a social fact in Britain, that it was sometimes hard to get people to kind of go back in time to a moment before that narrative had taken hold and look at the actual reality, the actual fact that this whole thing started with this pretty ridiculous and blatantly false letter, and to get them in that headspace was really hard. And then I also think sometimes there were things people didn't want to talk about, and so it was a mix of that and trying to navigate that at every moment. Like, are you hiding something, or are you just having trouble remembering that there was a time when you could apply logic to this, when it wasn't, made hazy by this narrative that came after?
Yeah, a vicious narrative in many ways. Hamza, this series is almost as much about you being this new Muslim journalist and coming to terms with what that means for your work. I want to play a clip that a lot of people have been citing as a particularly powerful moment in the series. It comes after you've interviewed a city councillor who doesn't dismiss the Trojan horse letter, but assumes it might have some legitimacy. Have a listen.
So my Muslim Pakistani mates, who aren't as native to white spaces, tell me that the West has it out for all of us Muslims. I've always denied it. I've always said they're paranoid, and it's talk like that that's held us back. It's talk like that.
So you fought with your friends about this?
I used to fight with them every opportunity I had. I've always argued against that. And then I sit opposite Albert Bohr. It just makes me think that as much as I was convinced that their stance wasn't right, maybe my stance wasn't right either.
Hamza, a lot of this story is fascinating because we're not just hearing you guys explore this mystery involving Muslims, but we hear you both discussing you as a Muslim. And there's a line from Brian about you being a Muslim first and a journalist second. And it's something I've had to grapple with too my entire life, how much of my identity affects my own journalism, especially on issues like terrorism and integration or obviously Islamophobia. I don't think I've ever resolved it myself. Do you think you'll ever be able to?
I don't know. I mean, I must say, I've begun this process legitimately, motivated to keep that at bay, to try to keep that outside the door as much as possible and try to engage in what I thought or I imagined what journalism was, which is, don't worry about that stuff. You are now a reporter. You sit here and you listen. You listen to what people are saying, and, that's your job, is to accumulate all these different perspectives and kind of broadcast that. I think I managed to maintain that for about one interview. And then beyond that, I just thought, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous for me to pretend otherwise. Like this, I'm from here. I'm from this community. I'm supposed to be speaking about Muslims as other, as they, instead of saying we. And it just didn't feel right. It felt more authentic, just to be honest, about who I am. And there was a moment in the story that happened that kind of really brought all that to a fore. And from that point onwards, I felt liberated. I was like, I'm going to be, it's who I am, and it's why I went into journalism, and I'm not going to be shy about that.
So, Brian, you talk about journalism in the series. There's a bit where you talk about it being defined by truth, people defining it as being about telling the truth, being unbiased, not having a political agenda. And some might hear that and say it's a very traditional J-school, even New York Times view of the world. And many would argue it's a view of the world that's outdated right now if it was ever the right view. It's a view that works for white people who become the baseline, the metric against which we measure unbiased. Did working with Hamza on this podcast, this story for, I think, 2 years, did that change your view of journalism, how we in the media approach stories like this one?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't just Hamza. A lot, this conversation has really come to the fore, especially after the summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd in our industry, and talking about point of view and perspective and these kind of accept professional norms that that have, in a way, like suppressed the truth and suppressed honesty and, made it hard for particularly, reporters and journalists of color and reporters and journalists, from other minority groups to be their full selves and do the work they want to do in this industry. So, I mean, all that's the context that this has happened, that's happened in the last few years that we've been reporting this. But even before that summer, like working so closely with Hamza on this story that was so personal to him, I don't think of myself as coming from like a stodgy kind of, objectivity-laden background. Yeah. I didn't go to journalism school. I work for a pretty creative radio show called This American Life, where I like to think that we push boundaries and we encourage point of view. But working alongside Hamza, I realized I was a little stuck in those ways of doing things as well. And I saw the limits of them and sometimes the detrimental nature of them as well to the work. And so the podcast really kind of like grapples with the tension between these ways of doing things and tries to offer maybe a middle way or certainly questions about the ways we've been doing things.
And Brian also grapples with this fundamental idea of anti-Muslim bias, whether it is in Birmingham or whether it's Donald Trump talking about Trojan horses and talking about Muslims infiltrating the United States. As you worked on the show as an American in Britain, did you draw the connections back across the Atlantic?
I did, yeah. And I hadn't thought about specifically the idea of the Trojan horse or a Trojan horse, as being, Islamophobic trope in the way that the quote unquote Jewish cabal is an anti-Semitic trope. I hadn't kind of put that together. And I think we were kind of, a lot of people casually use that term, certainly in reference to this story. But I started to realize, and the more and more we lived and breathed this stuff, that it is as dangerous a trope as that. This idea that, this notion that people advance that Muslims are infiltrating and using democratic systems to undermine Western democracies is very, very noxious and very dangerous and powerful. And that's why I believe this letter was so powerful. I hadn't even thought of, for instance, birtherism is a Trojan horse lie, an anti-Muslim Trojan horse lie, if you think about it. It's a racist lie, but it's also a claim that President Obama was, a secret Muslim infiltrating our democracy.
Hamza, what's so interesting about what I listened to your series is there's obviously been recent stories out of Birmingham. It's clearly Islamophobic to talk about a Trojan horse plot to take over schools. It's not Islamophobic to say that there is a genuine debate going on about how do you teach gay rights in school with conservative Muslim communities who are maybe not ready for that. And there's been protests in a place like Birmingham back, I think it was in 2019. We saw protests outside of schools. And then you think, well, if these Muslims not fitting in, but then I'm in the US where you have conservative Christians trying to pass a don't say gay law in Florida right now.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about that program, which, we were there when it was happening. I spoke to a few of the people who were involved in the protest, it was called No Outsiders. And fundamentally, I don't know if the intention was, I don't know what the intention was because it was a prevent-based program. Now, prevent is counterterrorism, right? So this lesson came through prevent. And I think if you approach any of these topics, gay rights with the conservative Muslim community, and you're speaking about it from the prism of extremism, prism of radicalization, you're going to get that, that reaction.
Hamza, we're sadly out of time, but you're right to end it by talking about the terrorism prism through which everything is seen. And that's why your podcast is so important for everyone to listen to. Hamza Sayed, Brian Reed, thank you so much for taking time out tonight. That does it for me tonight. Make sure to join us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok and Facebook. And I'll see you back here tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Eastern, right here on The Choice from MSNBC. But starting next week, you'll be able to find this show on the new MSNBC Hub on Peacock. It's part of a new experience coming to Peacock where you can stream some of your favorite MSNBC shows on demand. You can find the MSNBC Hub through Browse and stream this show anytime. New episodes of The Mehdi Hasan Show will post every evening, Monday through Thursday. From me, for now, good night. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of The Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.